te wharetoa, he perehitini o te Pāti Reipa ahau. Welcome everyone to this evening's virtual town hall meeting with our Prime Minister Chris Hipkins. My name is Jill Day and I'm the President of the Labour Party and I'll be your host for the meeting. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us and for your support for Labour. A huge thank you to Chris for taking the time out of your busy schedule of rest and recuperation to share this evening with us. Welcome.
Thanks, Jill. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. And I'm pleased to see so many of you here this evening. I do hope there aren't too many people waiting outside various town halls around the country. Of course, Chippy wouldn't be able to join us at any of those because he's in isolation. So before we start this evening, a couple of notes on how the town hall will run. The PM's going to make some opening comments shortly. Then I'll lead us through a conversation together about the big issues in the campaign. We'll pause a couple of times along the way for a little bit of fun, and then we'll have some questions. As we move through the topics, I'll be looking to you, the town hall audience, to provide many of the specific questions. Some people have already submitted questions, and there's no need for you to resubmit those ones if you already have. But to ask a question, if you haven't asked so far, use the Q&A button on the Zoom. It's near the middle of the ribbon of options below me. We welcome questions covering Labour's time in government, the campaign, the next 3 years, and the PM's life outside the beehive. We'll put up soft questions and hard questions, no problem. But we will draw the line at personal accusations or misinformation. So there's some other special Zoom features today, as this is a Zoom webinar, so you can see and hear us, but nobody can see or hear you. That means you don't have to worry about being on mute, you can nod thoughtfully, and you don't even have to worry about being dressed. So just sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation. And there's the chat function that comes through to the Labour team rather than to everyone. This helps everyone focus on the conversation our guests are having. So if you need anything during the Zoom, pop your request into the chat, but for questions, use the Q&A button. So now I'd like to introduce Chris Hipkins. While you're typing in your questions, it's a real pleasure to introduce our Prime Minister for his opening remarks. So Chris Hipkins is our PM for Remutaka. He's been there since 2008. He's been the Prime Minister, the Labour leader since January. He's a former Minister of Education, Health, COVID response, father of 2 gorgeous children, a lover of road cycling and Coke Zero. Yes, it's a niche combo. So over to you, Chris, for some opening remarks. We look forward to hearing from you this evening.
Thanks, Jill, and kia ora koutou, everybody. And can I first of all begin tonight by saying a very, very warm thank you to all those of you who have been sending me such lovely messages while I've been isolating with COVID-19. I think there's a certain symmetry to the fact that I'm isolating in the second to last week of the campaign, given the disruption that COVID-19 has caused to just about everything over the last 3 years. And I really do want to say thank you so much to everybody for all of the love and support that you've been pushing in my direction over the last few days. I'm on the mend and I'm looking forward to getting back out onto the campaign trail just as soon as I possibly can. But in the meantime, it's great to be able to keep in touch with everybody virtually. I'm incredibly optimistic about the future of New Zealand. It's been such an enormous privilege to be Prime Minister for about 6 months before this election campaign began. In that time, I had the opportunity to travel the length and breadth of New Zealand and see the amazing things that Kiwis are doing. I got to see the innovation that is inherent in our business community, where they're really driving forward, creating new opportunities, creating new products, and creating new jobs that are helping to grow New Zealand's economy. I got to see how hard Kiwis are working to create a better life for themselves and for their families. And I got to see just how resilient New Zealand can be and how we can come together as a community when times are tough. I know economically it's been pretty tough, but there have been other big challenges that have faced our country in recent times where we've really seen New Zealand at its best. We came together during our COVID-19 response to support each other. And we've come together to support those communities affected by flooding and by cyclones earlier this year. And I know that that Kiwi spirit will continue. We've also seen some real, really optimistic signs around our economy turning the corner after a really difficult period as well. Inflation is coming down again now. The economy is growing again. In fact, we've got some of the strongest growth rates in the world. Government debt remains low compared to so many other countries. We're getting the government's books back into surplus. And we've got a cost of living plan that's helping to support New Zealanders through what's been a really challenging period. When I reflect on the last 6 years that we've been in government, I reflect with a great degree of pride on the progress that we've made, but very mindful that there's still so much more to do. I think about child poverty, and I think about the 77,000 New Zealand children that we've lifted out of poverty. I'm proud of our record, but we know we've got more to do. I'm not going to rest while we still have children in New Zealand living in poverty. We're a better country than that, and we can be a better country than that. We've built 13,000 new public homes, and in the next 4 years, we're going to double that number. If the previous government had been building new public homes at the rate we're building them at, there wouldn't be a waiting list for public houses. We must keep that momentum going, and that's what a re-elected Labour government will do. We've reduced our climate emissions 3 years in a row, and we've got a plan to keep making progress. We're going to keep driving down our climate emissions because that's the number one thing that we've got to do in order to tackle the challenge of climate change. We've made a lot of progress. There's more work to be done, and we've got a plan to drive our emissions down. We've started the job of rebuilding our health and education systems after years of neglect. I remember coming into government and finding that we had hospitals with sewage running through the walls. We had children learning in cold, damp corridors and in hallways because they just didn't have the classrooms that they deserved for learning. We built thousands of new classrooms. We're spending record amounts of money upgrading our hospitals. We've got thousands more teachers, doctors, and nurses in our public service delivering for New Zealanders every day. It's been a hugely disruptive couple of years. And so New Zealanders will start to see the benefits of that extra investment that we've been making in the future. But I'm really proud of what we've been able to achieve so far. We put 1,800 more police on the beat to make our communities safer. But just as importantly, we've been really focused on addressing the causes of crime. I think it's a tragedy that we've got young New Zealanders falling onto a pathway towards crime at such a young age, and we can turn that around. Some of the programs that we've put in place as a government are making such a positive difference for young New Zealanders. They're getting them back on the straight and narrow, and they're helping them to find their path to a much more positive future than they otherwise might have. Now is not the time to turn back on all of that progress that we've been making. I know economically it can be challenging for Kiwi families at the moment. The cost of living crunch has hit New Zealanders hard. There's been a global pandemic of inflation following the global COVID-19 health pandemic. We are winning the battle on inflation in New Zealand. Inflation's coming down again, but there's still a way to go. Once we get inflation down, the cost of everything will stop continuing to climb, interest rates will start to come down, and people will be able to breathe a sigh of relief. In the meantime, we've got to support families through that period. Now, I know when times are tough like they are at the moment, it's natural for people to think, well, maybe it would be time for a change. But New Zealanders really need to ask themselves, a change to what? Are you really going to be better off if there is a change to a National Act New Zealand First coalition of chaos and cuts? We know National's tax plan simply doesn't add up. So to pay for their tax cuts, there'll be deep cuts to public services. Nicola Willis has said that she wants to make those cuts before Christmas. That means potentially thousands of New Zealanders out of work right before Christmas. And it's not just in Wellington. We're talking about public servants up and down our country, people working for the Department of Conservation who are preserving our conservation estate and providing tourists with the world-class experience they get when they come to New Zealand, people working at our border to keep drugs out, and people working in biosecurity to keep pests out of our country. These are the sorts of jobs that National talk about when they talk about a growth in the number of bureaucrats. They're actually people working on the front line to provide services to New Zealanders and to keep Kiwis safe. Thousands of them could be out of work before Christmas if there was a change of government. But we also know that some of our most vulnerable New Zealanders would really feel a change of government. National have been upfront. They want to cut over $2 billion out of the budget for benefits. That means our most vulnerable Kiwis would go backwards, and thousands more New Zealand children would end up living in poverty. We lifted 77,000 children out of poverty over the last 6 years, and we're committed to doing more. National's main commitment in this area is a policy that will push more children back into poverty. I think New Zealand's a better country than that. That's not the sort of change that New Zealanders are looking for in this election. And just today, we saw Goldman Sachs say that National's tax plan will actually increase inflation. That's going to result in higher interest rates for longer, hurting everybody with a mortgage. National's tax plan gives with one hand, but it takes more back with another. It's not a positive change for New Zealand's future. National would cut free prescriptions, introduced in this year's budget, as one of our measures to keep people out of hospitals with unnecessary illness. I know what a difference that's making. I've spoken to pharmacists up and down the country who are saying that people are now accessing their prescriptions where they previously weren't. And that means they're keeping on top of their health conditions, which means they don't end up in hospital emergency departments. National would take us backwards by cutting free prescriptions. They want to cut free public transport for our under 13s and cheaper public transport for our under 25s. They've said they'll cut 20 hours free early childhood education for 2-year-olds. And they'll make those cuts in order to give tax cuts that are weighted towards the wealthy, while everyday Kiwis see service cuts and mortgage and rates increases. If Christopher Luxon wins this election, New Zealanders will lose. I know everything hasn't been perfect over these last few years. COVID-19 disrupted everything, and a lot of the progress that we've been aiming to make as a government has been slower than we might have expected. That happens during a global pandemic. But now's not the right time to go backwards. We've got to keep moving forwards. My plan is about supporting New Zealanders through the cost of living crunch, whilst keeping the economy focused, making sure that we're continuing to move forward as a country, making sure we're continuing to grow our economy and create new, well-paying jobs, keeping record numbers of Kiwis in employment as we have over the last 6 years, not scrapping jobs and putting more people out of work. You know my values. You know the Labour Party's values. We've always been about looking out for working families, helping the average Kiwis to get by, making sure that the gains that we get from economic growth are shared by all New Zealanders, and that prosperity isn't something that just gets captured by those at the top. That's the promise we take into this election. We will continue to work every day to make sure that New Zealanders out there working hard are able to enjoy the fruits of their labour, that they're able to get ahead and create a better life for themselves and their families, that they can access healthcare when they need it, that their kids have a world-class education, that the infrastructure that we need as a country is invested in, our roads, our rail, our water supplies. These are the things that we're making progress on. These are the things that we stand for as a Labour team. These are the things that are at risk if there is a change of government at this election. Let's keep moving forward together. Let's keep New Zealand focused on the job ahead. Let's support those families who need it. You can make a difference at this election by showing up and voting and giving both of your votes to Labour. Your party vote for Labour will mean that all of that progress that we've made gets locked in and we don't go backwards as a country. There's about 10 days to go to make sure that you have your voice heard. I need you to make sure you're on the roll. I need you to make sure that you vote. And I need you to make sure that everybody you know gets out and votes as well. There is just too much at stake at this election to sit it out. We need everybody to get involved in this campaign and to get out there and vote. I'm looking forward to spending a bit of time with you, to answering your questions and to talking about the future for this incredible country. Thanks, Jill.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you, Chris. There really is so much at stake, and really appreciate the work that you have been doing and that you will do for New Zealand moving forward. And so we will now move into our topic areas, and our first topic is the economy and cost of living. As we all know, the cost of living has been top of mind for New Zealanders and for people around the world this year, and it's been a significant focus for Labour in this election. We've had several questions come in on this topic, including this one from Patricia, who asks, Do you have any plans to bring back the piggyback of partners on super if one partner is of retirement age but the other is not? Will retirement eligibility age remain the same?
We've absolutely committed to ensuring that the retirement eligibility age does stay the same. I looked closely over the time I've been a member of parliament over the last 15 years. I've looked at this because I recognise that people are living longer now, but increasing the retirement age would be massively inequitable. It would mean that those who don't live as long actually get penalised. And those are more likely to be people on low incomes and those from ethnic minorities, including our Māori New Zealanders. So raising the retirement age would actually be a step backwards for New Zealand. We can afford to keep the retirement age at 65 if we save for it, if we continue to make contributions to the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, which is what we have done every year that we have been in government. Again, this is another example of where New Zealand goes backwards under National. They cut contributions to the New Zealand Superannuation Fund last time they were in government, and we now pay the price for that. We've continued to make contributions to the superannuation fund so that we can keep the retirement age at 65.
Thank you. So here's one question combining elements from Jane's question and Catherine's question. If National says Labor has done nothing to help the economy, then why are they so keen to repeal everything Labor has done?
Well, that's a very good question. In fact, New Zealand's economy has grown faster under Labor, despite the fact that we have been through a global pandemic and we've had all of the natural disasters that we've dealt with. The economy's grown faster under Labor than it did under the last National government. And incidentally, it grew faster under the Clark-Cullen government than it did under the last National government as well. The idea that National governments grow the economy faster than Labor governments simply doesn't stack up. The track record, the data, the facts actually say otherwise.
You. This next question, I think, is a really important one that people really need to think about. Charles asks, National says the best way to meet the cost of living pressures is to give people some money in tax cuts. What's wrong with that?
The best way to help New Zealanders through the cost of living is to cut their costs and make sure their incomes are growing. Cutting taxes actually increases, in many cases, the costs that households will face, and it doesn't actually grow people's overall incomes. Let me give you one example. I think New Zealanders working hard on the minimum wage deserve to be able to get ahead from their hard work. Under our government, the minimum wage has increased nearly $7 an hour. The National Party opposed every one of those minimum wage increases. National's now promising a minimum wage worker a 25-cent an hour tax cut. What's going to leave them better off? Minimum wage increases, which they get under Labor and they know they'll get under Labor, or 25 cents, which they would get under National. I think it's clear growing wages is the way that you help people to get ahead. And the targeted cost of living plan that I've set out that includes taking GST off fruit and vegetables, making sure that we're keeping public transport free or half price for our younger New Zealanders, making sure we're increasing working for families by an extra $25 a week for those with children who are getting the in-work tax credit. These are things that will make a difference to those who need that extra help the most. But I'll tell you the thing that's really going to make a difference, and that's getting inflation down. Even if you're sitting here thinking, but there's nothing in that for me, I don't benefit from those things that you've just talked about. You will benefit from getting inflation back down again. And you will be penalised if inflation stays higher for longer, which it would under National's tax plan. Goldman Sachs said that today. They're saying what economists have been saying for some time. The National's tax plan would be inflationary. It would keep prices higher for longer. It would mean interest rates are higher for longer. Our focus on getting inflation down will mean in time, interest rates come down as well. And that's going to help Kiwi families to get ahead.
Thank you. So Jen asks, how will Labor's manifesto commitments affect economic growth over the next 3 years?
The Treasury set out in their pre-election fiscal update. There's a phrase that will excite very few people watching this call, other than maybe Grant Robertson, I'm sure is watching intently. But the Treasury set out before the election what they think the economy is going to do. They call it the pre-election fiscal update. And they've predicted that the economy is going to grow under the current economic settings that we have now, i.e. the settings of the Labor government. And that is because we're managing the government's finances responsibly, and we're doing the right things to make sure our economy is growing. As Prime Minister, in the brief time that I was Prime Minister before this campaign began, I made International trade, one of my priorities, signing new trade agreements with the European Union and getting into force the new free trade agreement that we've got with the United Kingdom. I also did a trade mission to China. That's going to help us to grow our economy, to grow our exports. The more of that we do, the richer that we can be as a country. That's what's going to make our economy grow.
Thank you. So this one's a bit more tricky. William asks, on the GST thing, I heard a family might make about $20 a month on this. That's not much, Chippy. Is that all you've got?
I've set out a 10-point cost of living plan, and taking GST off fruit and veggies is just one of those 10 points. Now, I know it's a small contribution to a household's budget, but I know what a difference it will make. As Prime Minister and as a minister before that, I still love to do my own supermarket shopping. I go to Pack and Save in Upper Hutt. The locals there will tell you they see me there all of the time. And I've seen families walk straight through the fruit and veggie aisle because of the cost of fruit and veg. Taking 15% off the price of fruit and veg is a minor contribution that we can make that will help them to have more choices when they're at the supermarket. I've watched them get to the checkout and put things back because they can't afford them. It's the basics that they're putting back, including fruit and veg. But it's not the only thing we're doing. We're also going to increase working for families, the in-work tax credit for those families with kids by an extra $25 a week. That's going to make a difference to families. We're going to make dental care free for the under 30s. That saving could be significant. Introducing 20 hours free early childhood education for 2-year-olds will save families with 2-year-old children hundreds of dollars every week. We're also making sure that we're keeping the prescriptions free for those who have health needs. That's going to save them money. Keeping the public transport free for our under 13s and half price for our under 25s is saving families quite a significant amount of money each week. So the real question that you have to ask yourself is, yes, you might get a couple of dollars a week out of a National Party's tax cut. And that for many New Zealanders, that's all it would be, because they're inflating their numbers by adding 2 people together, multiplying it out over a fortnight, and then adding some other things into it as well. But when you boil it down to what you'd actually get out of a tax cut, it's not that much. But you'd pay an awful lot for that tax cut and the things that would be cut to pay for it.
Thank you. So Justin asks, I've seen the Act say they'll end wasteful spending. I don't like wasteful spending. Doesn't that mean Act is right on this one?
Nobody likes wasteful spending. Every single government will have things that they've invested money in that they've looked back on and found that it wasn't feasible. Feasibility studies actually help us to ensure good value for money for the taxpayer. Spending money on a business case, for example, to identify whether something's feasible or not is far preferable to trying to do it and then finding out halfway through that it wasn't going to work. So as a government, we have been responsible in making sure that we're investing in feasibility studies for the sorts of things that New Zealanders have been asking us to focus on. And we've been tackling some of the big challenges for the future. That includes things like making sure we're driving towards 100% renewable electricity. The National Party think that that's a pipe dream and that we should go back to exploring for oil and gas. I don't think that it's a way of taking New Zealand forward. And so, yes, we are investing in those things. Will we drive out wasteful spending? Yes, of course we will. We will always look for it and we will always drive it out. But let's take another example. National said we spent too much on consultants and contractors. In the first 2 years we were in government, we actually had the bill for consultants and contractors going down. The reason that it increased was because COVID-19 came along and it was all hands to the pump. And that meant bringing in people with expertise that we needed to support us through a global pandemic. And our global pandemic response was one of the most successful in the world. It was worth every cent we spent on it.
Thank you. So we're going to move on to our second topic now. The next topic is race in New Zealand. This campaign has seen some parties choosing to race bait, which has led to Māori leaders across the country calling on politicians to condemn racism. I personally really appreciate the stand that you've made, Chippy, in calling this out and stating we have nothing to fear. There are times in a campaign where people have to do the right thing, regardless of the politics. Chippy, you did the right thing. Again, many of you are interested in this topic, including Brian, who has asked, what do you make of the recent controversy around co-governance?
I think that the issue around race relations and where it's used in an election campaign to race bait is really unfortunate. There's nothing to fear from co-governance as it's been put in place under successive governments, including extensively during the tenure of the last national government. Co-governance has been put in place over the management of a number of natural resources, and it was done during National's time in office, and it's been very successful. Co-governance recognises that Māori do have a range of legal rights that have been recognised by the courts. What the National Party, the ACT Party and the New Zealand First Party aren't saying is what they're proposing instead. Because if they don't go ahead with co-governance or with shared decision-making arrangements around things like water, for example, are they going to extinguish the rights that have been established by the courts that Māori have in water decisions? If that's what they're going to do, they're going to have a whole world of pain ahead of them, because we know from the foreshore and seabed experience that that would be incredibly divisive for New Zealand. Co-governance can work very effectively. It does not take away the rights of other New Zealanders. It does not disenfranchise other New Zealanders. It can lead to far better decision-making, a more collaborative decision-making process. So I have made the call as Prime Minister that wherever I see dog whistle racism, I will call it out for what it is. I want New Zealand to come together. I note the parties on the other side of the House, National, ACT and New Zealand First, are most vocal in issues around Māori when they are in opposition, not when they are in government. They are using Māori as a tool to get votes, and I think that's disgraceful.
I agree, thank you. Zufi asks, would you ever do a voice election referendum for Māori?
Well, we don't. It's a slightly different issue in the Australian Parliament, in the sense that there's no real recognition for Indigenous Australians at all in Australia. Now, I have to be very careful because, as Prime Minister, you know, diplomacy says I should keep out of Australian domestic politics. But I think it's very admirable that the Australians are having this debate, and they're having it now. I think New Zealand's actually further ahead in this than the Australians are. We already have recognition of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in New Zealand statute. We already have Māori seats in Parliament. So I think we're a bit further ahead than the Australians are. This is a small first step for them. And I wish those campaigning for a yes vote all the very best.
Thank you. Rudy asks, why do you think there's been a lot of discussion on race in this campaign in particular?
I think we see discussion on race from the parties on the right of the political spectrum when they're trying to win a few votes by picking on a minority of New Zealanders. Whether it's Winston Peters talking about an Asian invasion, David Seymour talking about blowing up the Ministry for Pacific Peoples, or the National Party scaremongering about co-governance. It's all designed to do one thing, and that is to drive votes to those parties. I don't think that's the way you should win votes in New Zealand politics. And it's not a style of politics I will ever engage in.
Thank you. So we're going to have a little bit of fun now. We're going to take a quick break to vote on your favourite chippy moment so far. You can see the options on the screen. To vote in the poll, just use the poll feature in Zoom that's coming up on the screen shortly. We'll give you a moment to think carefully about your favourite. So Chippy, what can you tell us about these pictures?
Well, there's a lot that I could say, really. I mean, the one on the top left there is probably the most infamous of those moments so far. And it was really a moment where I didn't realise what I'd done until sometime after I had done it. I sort of knew that what I was saying didn't quite come out the way I was anticipating. But it wasn't until I'd handed over to Ashley Bloomfield and he was partway through answering the next few questions that I realised exactly what it was that I had said. And I then had to try and keep a straight face for the rest of the press conference. So it gave everybody a little bit of light relief, I think, at a time when Kiwis are really looking for that.
Those the photo on the street there. Do you want to explain to people what was happening there?
Well, I decided that Jacinda had announced that she was retiring and standing down as Prime Minister. And I decided that I would go out for a walk the next morning. No decisions had been made about who was going to put their hand up for it. And I thought that I could just slip out the side door of the hotel and go and have a nice, peaceful stroll along the Napier waterfront. And I got about halfway down the road, and unfortunately there was a news hub camera there loitering, waiting. And so they caught me in my beach gear with my paint-stained hat and my Sharkies sunglasses, which I'd bought from a Z service station at some point. And there was no escaping them.
Fantastic picture. Ooh. Thank you. So our third topic this evening has been a really eventful time since Labour came into government, both in New Zealand and around the world. Government is all about doing what you can to advance your agenda despite what's going on around you. It would have been understandable if we'd stopped doing everything else after COVID hit, but the Labour government kept on working, whether it was building hospitals, upgrading classrooms, and building social housing. Chippy, you knew these issues had to be addressed, and you understood the importance of pressing on. One of our attendees, Mason, has written in to say, "Hello, Chris. Me and my nana voted Labour. I hope you are well. My question is, what is it like being a Prime Minister?"
Thanks very much, Mason. That's a fantastic question. It's like nothing I really expected it to be. Look, let's start at the beginning. I have loved being a member of Parliament, and I loved being a minister. I particularly love being Minister of Education. I think everybody will understand just how passionate I am about education. And I didn't really expect to become Prime Minister in the way that I did. So it was an enormous privilege and an opportunity, a privilege to be able to take on the job. It's a pretty all-consuming job. It takes up every waking moment that you have. You wake up thinking about it, you go to bed thinking about it. I've loved every moment of it. I really feel like I was just starting to get into it, and the election campaign rolled around. I've only had 6 months in the job before the campaign started, and I'd really like a full term at it because I think that New Zealand has so much opportunity ahead of it. I think that a lot of what we have done over the last 6 years is heading New Zealand in the right direction. There's no doubt there's been disruptions along the way. And if I reflect critically on that, perhaps we should have been a bit more upfront with Kiwis when COVID hit and said, hey, actually, the stuff we said we were going to do, it's going to take a bit longer now than it was otherwise going to take. And maybe we probably should have been a bit more explicit with New Zealanders about that along the way. But we are heading in the right direction. Making sure we're investing in health and education and housing, lifting kids out of poverty, tackling climate change, rebuilding our infrastructure. These aren't things that we can take for granted. These are things that we have chosen to prioritise. Providing free and healthy school lunches. Those are things we've chosen to prioritise. These are things that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't been in government.
Thank you. Diana asks, looking back over Labour's first 2 terms, what other than the COVID response are you most proud of?
Of course, I'm incredibly proud of our COVID response. It was one of the best in the world, and I can tell you it was the cause of a lot of sleepless nights for me during that time. But if I think of my time as Minister of Education, I know I'm a little biased in talking about education because it was my portfolio and it is a huge passion of mine. I'm very proud of the free and healthy school lunches program that we've put in place. And I'm also incredibly proud of the work that we've done to boost the number of apprenticeships that we have. We've had record numbers of people signing up for apprenticeships over the last few years. And I think that's going to serve New Zealand incredibly well in the future. It's frustrated me my entire time in politics to see successive governments failing to invest in vocational education. We have so many skill shortages that we can solve by training our own. And that means things like apprenticeships. So the Apprenticeship Boost program that I put in place as Minister of Education, the record numbers of sign-ups that we've had for apprenticeships, these are the things that are going to help to move us ahead. And they're the things that, as Minister of Education, I was most proud of.
Thank you. So on the flip side, Anna asks, I've heard National say government spending went up 80% under Labour, including failures like Kiwi Build and the Auckland Cycle Bridge that never happened. How can I trust the next 3 years will be different from the last 6?
I know the National Party like to talk about $1 billion a week in extra government spending, so let's break that down a little bit to make it a bit more understandable for people. That extra $1 billion a week, 150 million of that goes to New Zealand superannuitants. That's making sure that our people who are living on superannuation aren't going backwards. $200 million of that every week is going into our health system. That's paying for more doctors, more nurses, better healthcare for Kiwis. Another $100 million of that is going into our education system. It's paying for more teachers. It's making sure that they're being paid better. They're getting better salaries. It's funding our early childhood education system better. We've still got more work to do there, but there's no question we've made progress. Where does the rest of the money go? Building more public houses than any government since the 1950s costs more money. And so we've been investing in that. Making sure we're funding our defence force properly. Making sure that we're paying our public service workers properly. Strengthening our defences at the border, whether that's biosecurity or customs, so that we don't have drugs coming into the country. Those drug busts that you see on the TV news, they don't happen by accident. They're happening because we've invested in extra customs workers who are actually making sure drugs get busted as they're coming into the country. The biosecurity workers are making sure we don't have things like Mycoplasma bovis making its way back into the country. M. bovis cost New Zealand hundreds of millions of dollars. Investing in biosecurity helps us to avoid those things. We could talk about our conservation workers, the people who are protecting our dock estate. These are the teacher aides who are working to support people and to support some of our most vulnerable kids in schools. The list could go on. We've got more probation officers and more correctional officers, making sure that we're rehabilitating people who've been engaged in criminal activity so that when they come back out again, they don't reoffend. All of these things cost money. That's what we've been investing in. Have there been some things that haven't worked out according to plan? Yes, there have. Kiwi Build has delivered for a number of families, but not the volume that we set out to deliver for. We actually transferred a lot of the money out of Kiwi Build into things like progressive home ownership and into things like making sure we're building infrastructure for housing so that the private sector can build more houses faster. The private sector is now building over 50,000 houses a year, and the infrastructure funding that we've put in place is helping them to do that. So not everything's been perfect. I'll never claim to be perfect, but I will claim that when we've made a mistake or when something hasn't worked out according to plan, we'll own that. That's been my approach the entire time I have been a minister in the government. If something's not working, you make sure you fix it.
Thank you. So Judy asks, if you could have one do-over over the last year, what or who would you do over?
Well, I'll take the more charitable interpretation of that question, shall I? And maybe say, if there were things that I could go back at and look at again, how would I do things differently? I think if I think back over the last couple of years, I'll extend the time frame of the question out a little bit and just speak to one of the elephants in the room during this campaign that no one's really talking about, and that is the COVID response, and it is the issue of vaccinations. I'm really proud of our COVID response. I'm really proud of the fact that New Zealand had very high rates of vaccination. But I also do recognise that was through that vaccination campaign that we started to see some division in our COVID response, which up until that point had been a very united response to COVID. If I could go back again now, I would try so hard, even harder than we did at the time, to try and keep the country together through that period. Vaccine misinformation and disinformation has done so much harm in New Zealand. It's caused the splintering of an otherwise rock-solid response that we had as a country to COVID-19. And so I do regret that. I don't regret the fact that we had high numbers of New Zealanders being vaccinated, because it's one of the reasons we've had one of the lowest mortality rates, one of the lowest death rates from COVID-19 in the world. But I do regret the division that vaccination has caused.
Thank you. So on a different note, Eli, whose favourite sport is soccer, asks, what's your favourite sport, Chris? And someone called Grant, who hasn't given his last name, asks, can Eli's favourite sport have more funding?
Well, goodness me. My favourite sport, let's see. I mean, I love watching soccer. I think soccer is a fast-paced game. And goodness me, didn't we all enjoy the FIFA Women's World Cup being co-hosted by New Zealand? What an amazing inspiration for young women athletes right the way across the country and, in fact, across the world. I've thoroughly enjoyed the Warriors this year, loved watching the league. I've been so proud of the Warriors, up the Wars. And in the summer, love a bit of the cricket. There's nothing quite like having the cricket playing in the background while you're sitting on some scaffolding painting the house.
I love it. All right, we're going to go on to another topic now. So we're going to talk about energy and about climate change. Around the world, it seems like there's a new event every few days, giving us reason to worry about the impacts of climate change. The state of the world makes me even more proud to see our emissions in New Zealand dropping, and the Labour government continuing to find creative and meaningful ways to help New Zealanders make the right choices for our climate. This is a topic close to many people's hearts. For example, Patrick has asked, I've heard National talking about corporate welfare. Why is it a good idea to pay companies to reduce their emissions? Can't we just make them do it?
New Zealand needs to reduce its emissions from greenhouse gases. We pay for that through the emissions trading scheme. It means that those who are emitting pay through the emissions trading scheme for their emissions. In order to reduce our overall level of emissions, our government's made the decision that we're going to reinvest that money that comes through the emissions trading scheme into initiatives that actually help to reduce the emissions in the first place. So things like the New Zealand Steel deal, for a relatively modest investment from the government through the emissions trading scheme, because bearing in mind that this is money that has been collected because through emissions, we're going to reinvest that in bringing down emissions. That's going to cut 1% of New Zealand's overall emissions every year. Investing in Fonterra to make sure they're removing coal-fired boilers from their production line, that's also going to help New Zealand. It's going to reduce our emissions, but it's also going to help our clean green image around the world and make sure our dairy products stay internationally competitive. Now, the money we collect through the emissions trading scheme is designed to help reduce the emissions in the first place. By reinvesting that money and reducing emissions, we're actually helping New Zealand to turn down our overall level of emissions. If we didn't do that, we would have to still somehow turn our emissions down or pay someone else to do it. I'd rather pay New Zealand businesses to reduce their emissions than buy offshore carbon credits, which is one of the alternatives, which means we're paying another country to reduce their emissions instead.
Thank you. So Lawea, aged 12, asks, what is your priority for endangered species in Aotearoa?
We've released, and I want to acknowledge the work that we've done with our coalition partner or our confidence and supply partner in this last parliament, the Green Party. We've reduced the national policy statement on Indigenous biodiversity. It's a bit of a mouthful, but in essence, it's about saying we've got to stop killing off species in New Zealand. So we've got to look at where their natural habitats are and the activities that we're doing that are destroying the habitats of endangered species in New Zealand. Indigenous biodiversity is so important to our country. So we've got to think about things like our wetlands and making sure we're preserving our wetlands and restoring our wetlands. We've got to think about reforestation, i.e. planting back native forests in some areas, again, to protect our Indigenous biodiversity. Of course, there's other benefits that come from planting more trees as well, but that is one of them. So the National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity sets out a really clear direction of travel, and it sets out a plan for how we can do that.
So Dennis asks, in 2014 and 2017, Labour's election manifesto promised to extend the ban on mining on conservation land to the Southern Coromandel and other areas. Why has Labour not fulfilled this commitment in its term in office?
We've still got some unfinished business there. We've had to work through a couple of tricky issues, one of which was Indigenous rights to being able to access pounamu, for example. I'm confident that we can resolve those issues. We just need a little bit more time to do that. A lot of these projects, I'll be frank, some of these projects didn't get the attention that they otherwise might have whilst we were dealing with the global pandemic, and so things slowed down there a bit. I'm very committed to making sure that we see through those commitments.
Thank you. So we're going to move on now to another interesting piece. We're giving away a Labour merchandise super pack to one clever attendee. So this is the prize here. As you can see, some pretty special merch there, and a fantastic prize for people to wear with pride. So here's the question. You need to place these ginger men in alphabetical order by surname. Answers in the chat. We'll draw one correct answer to win a Labour merch super pack. And I'll give you a moment to have a think. We did have to remove Prince Harry because we discovered that he doesn't technically have a last name. So he's not on the list. Yes, and C is not just another picture of Chippy. All right. So our fifth topic, we've got about 10 minutes left. So if it's okay, Chippy, we'll go nice and quickly now. I'd like to ask about public services now. William has written in to ask, what can Labor do to improve the provision of specialist mental health services, not only primary services? And relatedly, Alyssa asks, what will you do to train more psychologists and psychiatrists?
So we do need to train more psychologists and psychiatrists, and we've set out a plan to do that, including increasing the number of spaces that we've got available for training people in those areas. That has been one of the impediments to progress. We just haven't got enough people to do the jobs in those areas. So we want to step that up. We want to keep stepping that up. Providing access and choice, so free primary health care, free mental health counselling sessions through primary health care for free is making a difference. Over 1 million New Zealanders have now accessed that, and that's increasing month by month, and we've got to continue to make progress on that. Some of the investments that we've been making in rebuilding our hospitals have actually involved targeted investments in rebuilding some of our mental health facilities, which we know are in some of the worst condition of any of the facilities that our hospitals operate in. And so we've got to do more of that as well. So the short answer to your question is more of everything. We've got to continue the momentum that we've built up. We've been building a new mental health support system from scratch. That doesn't happen overnight, but the fact that over 1 million New Zealanders have now been able to access free mental health support through their GP is a sign that we're making good progress.
Thank you. Dylan asks, what would Labor do to help first home buyers?
Well, there's an awful lot. I'll tell you that one of the things that we will do, we'll make sure that we're continuing a focus on getting inflation back down, because that's going to help to get interest rates back down, and that's going to help all home buyers, and particularly first home buyers will be looking at that thinking, my goodness me, those mortgage repayments would be pretty lofty if interest rates stay higher for longer, which of course they would do under National, and that's what the economists have been making very clear over the last few days. There are some things that we're not going to do. We're not going to bring back interest deductibility or lower the bright line test, which is what the National Party are proposing to do, which would be a boon for landlords, and actually would likely, again, have an impact on first home buyers because they would preference landlords over first home buyers. But the other thing that National wants to do is bring back foreign buyers into the market. That's going to push up house prices. National wants to sell $5 billion of New Zealand homes to overseas buyers every single year in order to pay for their tax cuts. I don't think that's the way you pay for tax cuts. It shuts out New Zealand first home buyers. It will push up the price of houses for everybody. And I think Kiwis deserve better than that.
Thank you. And Laura asks, can you explain why your policy for free dental care is for up to 30? Surely all New Zealanders should benefit, or at least include 65 plus.
That's a fantastic question. The Labor Party's ultimate goal is to get free dental care for everybody. Just as it's free if you show up at an emergency department, we want it to be free if you go to the dentist for basic dental care. We're starting with the under 30s first, because we know that actually that's a time of life when tooth decay really starts to kick in. And so if you can tackle that before it gets worse, then actually people will need less dental care later on in life. So that's why we've targeted that age bracket first. But our plan is to extend dental care to everybody over time. The other reason that we've had to start relatively modest and start with the under 30s first is we're going to need to train a lot more dentists and dental hygienists, and we're going to need to build more capacity in the system in order to be able to deliver free dental care for everybody. So that gives us 3 years to roll it out first to the under 30s, and then to make sure we've got a plan in place to roll it out to other New Zealanders as well.
Thank you. So we've got a news flash now. We've got some poll results. No, it's not a TV1 poll, it's our poll. So in our earlier poll that we asked people to choose their favourite Chippy moment, So Spread Your Legs came in at 49%. The Big Debate Win came in at 37%. The Dirty Dog Interview was 8%. There's a slight typo there, 8%. And the Global Sausage Rolls was 6%. So now on to our sixth topic. Let's call it all about the campaign itself. Alana asks, would Chris consider doing the press debate with the minor parties?
I was asked about that. Ultimately, I think New Zealanders deserve to hear Christopher Luxon and I debating each other. It is Christopher Luxon and I who could be Prime Minister after the election. And so I will welcome the opportunity to debate Christopher Luxon at any opportunity. I think simply, having all of the parties together shouting at each other wouldn't actually provide New Zealanders with much more information. The last time there was an all-party debate like that was actually 2002, so over 20 years ago. And they stopped doing debates in that format because actually they didn't leave New Zealanders more informed by the end of them.
Thank you. Claire asks, given National can't prove their costings, will you go hard on this for the next week?
Well, we've certainly been doing that over the last few weeks, and yes, we'll continue to do that over the next week, because I think what New Zealanders do understand is that their costings don't add up. I think what they're increasingly coming to understand is what that actually means for them. The fact that National's plans don't add up means more cuts. It means more cost for households, because the services that they'll be cutting will add costs to New Zealand households, but actually keeping inflation higher for longer, keeping interest rates higher for longer, that's going to really hurt Kiwi household budgets. And so we'll certainly be talking about that in the next week and a half.
Fantastic. Nigel asks, what should New Zealanders look for in the third and now final leaders debate?
I hope that we'll have a good airing of issues over the third and final leaders debate. One thing that you should be looking for is how many questions Christopher Luxon answers, and how many of them he just sticks to his pre-scripted talking points that have been determined by a focus group, because that seems to have been most of his approach so far, is actually to not answer any questions and just stick to a whole bunch of cliches and slogans that have been strung together. You might not always like my answers, but I at least try and answer the question that's been asked. So that's what I'll be endeavouring to do in the next debate as well.
Fantastic. Slightly broader, George asks, what's the biggest lesson you learned governing in coalition with New Zealand First after 2017?
Expect the unexpected. They were certainly not particularly consistent in the time that we were in government. And one of the great frustrations was the amount of time and energy that got put into progressing a whole lot of issues only for New Zealand First to change their mind at the last minute, and often for no particular apparent reason. I don't think New Zealand First is a force for stability in government. Winston Peters has built his entire political career on opposing things. I don't think he actually knows how to build things. And so I think if we want a government that's going to lead New Zealand forward, having Winston Peters and New Zealand First in it is not going to be a recipe for that.
Thank you. So now for our final question. It's now time for our final question of the night, which comes from Joy, who asks, what's the best short key message we can use to get people to party vote Labour?
Party vote Labour to keep New Zealand moving forward. Party vote Labour to stop National's cuts. Party vote Labour because you believe that health and education are worth investing in. Party vote Labour because you believe that New Zealanders who work hard should be able to get ahead, and the best way of doing that is to grow their wages and create better employment conditions for them so that they see the benefits of their hard work. Party vote Labour because you think that the way to fix the housing crisis is to build more houses. We've made a lot of progress over the last 6 years, but there is still so much more work to be done. So party vote Labour to continue with progress.
Fantastic. Well, thanks to you, Chippy, our PM, and all the best for a continued recovery. We hope that you bounce back quickly, and we wish that you look after yourself. We appreciate what you're doing. And a congratulations to Caroline White, who's won the Merch Super PAC. Nice job and great alphabetising, Caroline. We'll be in touch tomorrow to get your prize to you. And so I'd also like this evening to thank the New Zealand Labour Party team who have been monitoring the chat and questions and have put this Zoom together this evening. Most of all, thanks to everyone for participating on the Zoom and for your support for Chippy and for Labour. Ko Mārie.
Ko Mārie.